Steve, gan usually is more an northern Bahadun and Aulagas con kind live and up fi Kursiak na make to the Turation Troika. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honour to be in Donegal to talk about life after the Troika. The slide I would have put up said there is no after the Troika. If we mean by that we somehow resume economic freedom, sovereignty to do certain things which somehow we can't do at the moment, we will not be returning to that. We will be undergoing ongoing external supervision. And we have to remember that the Troika is a threesome. There's the ECB, the European Central Bank, and of course one of Europe's solutions to this crisis has been to try and bring together an integrated banking system with common supervision, with control from effectively the European Central Bank. So in the future, the European Central Bank will be watching our banking system very closely, and we'll be answerable to them in terms of the banks. In addition, we have the European Commission, which is the third part of the Troika. And the European Commission, of course, part again of the response to the economic crisis was to bring in new fiscal rules which belong to everyone. And of course we passed the Fiscal Treaty, and we now have the Fiscal Responsibility Act passed by the Dáil, which identifies very clear, precise fiscal rules and regulations for the future. And of course the European Commission will be keeping a strong eye on us on an ongoing basis to see that we meet those fiscal targets. What's often forgotten is that before the Troika programme, we were already in an EU programme, which is the excessive deficit procedure. If we borrow too much money, the Commission wants us to pull it back to the agreed rule, and they watch us and they comment on how we do it. So we were already in a programme even before 2010. So with new fiscal rules, with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we will not be escaping supervision. And of course we have to remember as well that we owe lots of money to both the Commission and to the IMF. So the IMF, when it lends money to people, it likes to get it back. So it will have an element of post-programme supervision or monitoring. Now, of course, their power is a little bit weaker, because up to now, if we didn't do what we were told, they wouldn't give us the next bundle of money. Now they wait for us to pay it back. So we're not quite under the same control, as it were. But in terms of the basic principles, we have signed up to new fiscal rules, we have signed up to definite procedures for getting borrowing down, and those will remain the case. Not necessarily immediately after the Troika, we may well have a couple of years before we have to come up with the detailed programmes. But the government has already committed itself to ongoing reduction of borrowing to meet those targets. And of course, in addition, we're going to have to borrow vast amounts of money over the next several years in the markets to recycle our debt. Governments never pay back their debt. We have a debt of over 200 billion euro. We'll never pay that back. What will happen is that when bits of it come due, we'll borrow in the market to replace that. So we'll refinance or recycle the borrowing. And of course, where will we get that money? Well, unless we're in a new bailout programme, we get it from the market. And the market will have certain expectations of how we should behave before they will lend money to us at low interest rates. So external supervision will continue, not necessarily in the same detailed quarterly reports and so on that we have at present, but it will continue, and it will continue in a much more extensive way than was the case before this crisis began in 2008. So we're going to have external supervision. But as the Chairman has identified, and one thing I should mention is the Chairman absolutely guaranteed me that the principle of distinguishing between the message and the messenger would apply tonight. So I'll hold him to that. Maybe external supervision, as has been mentioned, is not such a bad thing, because we're not that great in running our own affairs. If we look back at the longer-term economic history, population declined from independence up to 1961. 1961 was the lowest population in the state, in the history of the state. The rest of Europe and the rest of the world had growing population, and we had decreasing population. And of course, no place to know it better than Donegal in terms of huge emigration, negating a very high birth rate, and being one of the few countries in Europe where the population was declining. Emigration was endemic throughout most of our long-term history. And in fact, if we take the 1950s just as an example, in that decade about 400,000 people emigrated from Ireland. Now, that's 400,000 people out of an average population of about 3 million. And as you know, our emigration was primarily single people between the age of 15 to 30. It wasn't families. So it was 400,000 very young, potentially vibrant people that could have contributed to the economy. So we're not too good at managing our own affairs. We've had a major financial crisis in the past, public financial crisis. Started in the 70s and then lingered on through the 1980s. For example, in 1980 and 81, our annual government deficit was about 16% of GDP. That's worse than it is at present. So we've been there. We do crises very well, and even we can do them again and again. In 1991, our total national debt was just a little lower than 100% of GDP. At the moment, it's 120%. So we've been there, we've done it, we've had major problems. And in fact, throughout the 1980s, we found it very difficult to adjust those problems. And from 1982 up to 1986, the deficit hovered between 13 and 12%. And then, of course, from 1988 onwards, it started to be reduced. Not least because of tax amnesties and so on. But we have a history of, as has been pointed out, crises. And not just public financial crisis. Lots of you will remember the PMPA. Lots of you will remember the Insurance Corporation of Ireland. Major financial disasters which had to be bailed out by the taxpayer. And of course, now we have Quinn the next time. So we might be bad at banks, but we seem to be disastrous with insurance companies. We're very weak in terms of industrial innovation and creativity. And I've heard people talk about we have to restore the innovative capability of the Celtic Tiger. We have to restore the entrepreneurship of it. Never existed. The Celtic Tiger was a multinational-driven phenomenon and a construction-driven phenomenon. It wasn't driven by inventions and products and companies exporting. It was primarily construction and multinationals. Now, there's nothing wrong with multinationals. I mentioned them simply to emphasize that our economy is significantly dependent on that. Over 90% of our exports come from multinational companies. 99% of all our chemical and pharmaceutical exports come from multinationals. Over 90% of our electronics and that kind of computer gadgetry comes from multinationals, which of course means that there's not a lot coming from the indigenous side. In fact, if you look at indigenous industry, 60% of all its exports are from the food-drink side. The other high technology sectors, the ones I just mentioned, would be talking about 10% of the total. So we have a long way to go to be a modern, innovative, dynamic, industrial Sweden or Finland or Denmark. In fact, without multinationals, we'd be lost. But it's not all pessimism. We have huge economic strengths. For example, we are among the world's best at attracting foreign direct investment. We're the world's leading operators of the bloodstock side. We're the pioneers and still best at low-cost airlines. Our food industry is excellent. Our graduate output is better than most of our competitors. Our population is very young, something that Germany would envy greatly in terms of having that dynamic young population capable of developing in the future. Our infrastructure has dramatically improved, although again, people in Donegal can say, where is he coming from? In other parts of the island, the infrastructure has improved. And we have, at least up to now, a stable political system. Although even that stability is up for grabs into the future. Now, if we think of the role of the public finances are a critical input to economic and social development. In fact, the strange thing about public finances is that we all love public expenditure. No one would be opposed to more health consultants, shorter waiting lists, better disability care, smaller class sizes, IT of the latest variety in every primary school, every school kid getting a laptop. All of these things are desirable. Better infrastructure, better roads, better parks, you name it, we would want it. The only problem is we don't like paying for it. And the only way we pay for it is primarily taxes, and maybe if we discover oil and the government changes the tax rules and we get revenue from that, but primarily it's taxes. And of course we don't like paying taxes. And of course that's the big dilemma. And even where we like paying taxes, if we have high taxes, our behaviour changes. So, for example, we might, as a national economic policy, decide a 35% VAT rate is essential to help the economy. And of course, where will most of you do your shopping if there's a 35% VAT rate here and it's 20% in Derry? Equally, we might say we have to have higher tax rates for people on income, and let's have a 70% marginal tax rate. And we might again, in principle, accept that as necessary. But of course, in reality, our behaviour would change. We'd be less reluctant to do work, more reluctant to do work, more reluctant to take risks. So there are consequences to the taxes. And unfortunately as well, everybody wants something from the public purse. If you look at all the budget submissions, and I work on various budget submissions as well, so I'm as bad as anyone, you'll find everyone's looking for more expenditure. In my own sector, the university sector, we want more money to try and improve our capabilities to compete internationally. Donegal as an area wants more money for infrastructure, industrial development. IBEC says don't put any more taxes on us, but go ahead with the expenditure cuts. So by and large, everyone wants more money. I've never come across anyone from an interest group saying, listen, we don't need all that money, or we don't need those tax concessions. So the government has a major problem and a mismatch in terms of the finances. We've got this almost infinite demand for expenditure and great reluctance at paying the taxes, and even where we want to pay them, having to deal with the economic effects. Can I just briefly mention some of the constraints that will arise in terms of the budgets for the future? We have a fiscal rule, which is in our own legislation with the 2012 Act, and we voted for it in the fiscal treaty, that we would go to a structural deficit of 0.5%. In 2014, when the Troika, or the bit of it, the IMF is gone and the other two are there, that structural deficit will be 4.6%. So we have to reduce that structural deficit from 4.6 to 0.5. Now, as I say, we get a bit of leeway to do it. The government's intention is to do it by about 2019. But the big issue is that we have been entirely focused on the 3%. The 3% is just target number 1. The structural deficit target is target number 2, which never gets mentioned because we've been preoccupied with target number 1, as it were. We also have to continually reduce our borrowing level, because our national debt is about 120% of GDP. According to the fiscal rules, it should be 60%. So what we have to do is reduce that 120 to 60 over 20 years, which means, of course, that constrains the amount of additional borrowing we can have. In terms of the rules versus the actual, in 2014, as I say, our structural deficit will be far higher than it's supposed to be in the fiscal rules. Our national debt relative to GDP will be far higher than it's supposed to be. So we'll have that continual adjustment over the next several years to get the structural deficit down. By and large, there is little scope for increased expenditure unless it's matched by equal increases in taxes. In 2014, for example, and that's why I said stable political system at the moment, when people start realising this, this is not just a short-term problem. This is something that will go on. In 2014, government expenditure is about 69.1 billion, based on their forecasts. And of course, forecasts depend on the future and can change. In 2014, it's 69.1. In 2016, it's going to be 69. That gives very little scope for significant increases in expenditure in all the things that we want to see. So there's little scope for increased expenditure and very little scope to, as it were, re-spend the money that we had to have in cutbacks over the last few years. From 2016 to 2019, looking at government figures and drawing conclusions from them, overall government expenditure, excluding interest payments, at maximum will increase by 2%. That's in total over those several years. So again, little scope for significant increase. And of course, as I say, we can get around that, because one of the things we forget about austerity is that no one, and I IMF can contradict me in a moment. No one of our external supervisors, by and large, care how we do our austerity, providing it's sustainable and rational. It's not promises that can't be delivered. But if it's sustainable and rational, if we, for example, wanted to have a higher income tax and to spend the money, I don't see there be any problems with it. So equally, we can spend more on public services, providing we collect more taxes. And that brings us to probably the mature, grown-up debate that we're going to have in the future as to what kind of society we want, what kind of services we expect, and what kind of taxes will finance it. Now, I will immediately declare my personal interest. I don't like taxes. I don't want higher taxes. But anyone else can have different views, as it were. So, of course, we can increase expenditure, providing we match it by tax increases. And an argument has been made, if you look at the normal indicator of tax burden, that we're relatively low tax burden by EU standards, and that's the total tax relative to GDP. But there's lots of quibbles in our economy as to whether GDP is a good measure of our wealth. And if you adjust it for some of those quibbles, we come out at about the average level of European tax burden, but still significantly less than the very high tax economies like Sweden and Finland. So we have to make that decision, as it were. Do we want higher taxes? How will the higher taxes affect the growth rate? And if we don't mind that, well, then we can have the expenditure. But we can't have the expenditure without the taxes. In broad conclusion, then, I'd say we're at the end of the severe fiscal consolidation in 2015, where we have to take chunks out of existing services. But external monitoring will continue. We have new fiscal rules. The fiscal rules will be, I think, implemented a little tougher and a little more seriously than was the case before this crisis in 2008. Even with reasonably optimistic growth in the economy, there's little scope for increased expenditure unless we have new taxes to do it. And then, of course, we're left with the question of whether new taxes are good for the economy. But by and large, tight fiscal discipline will continue for several years hence. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.